For my country report, I chose the beautiful country of Brazil. Located in South America and bordering the Atlantic Ocean, Brazil is only slightly smaller than the entire continental U.S. Its rich biodiversity, high level of investment in renewable energy, and rich culture are all primary reasons I chose to learn more about this country. But first, let's look at the people of Brazil. Portuguese is the official language of the country. The majority of the population identifies as Roman Catholic, about 65%, and Protestant, about 22%. Brazil is the sixth largest country in the world with a population of 204 million. About 86% of the population lives in an urban environment. 98% of the population has access to clean drinking water, and 82.8% has access to sanitation facilities. Brazil has an expanding middle class. Although its agricultural sector is well established with exports like coffee, soybeans, wheat, corn, and sugarcane, many economists argue that Brazil has the potential to catch Dutch disease, relying too heavily on commodities like finite resources. Without properly diversifying the goods Brazil has to offer, the economy could suffer. Brazil has 15.31 billion barrels of proven reserves, so this may be tempting for the government there, in order to benefit from tax revenues. The problem with relying on raw materials is that prices are more variable, and this industry usually only generates very few jobs. What will happen when the reserves are exhausted and the workers are out of work? Like any population, if the people are unhappy with what the government is doing, they will protest to get their message across. Brazil is a federal republic, meaning that there is a president, a constitution, an executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. Usually, when a country has a lot of extractable resources, government corruption is inevitable. Corruption alienates the people from those in power. The ruling class has a surge of incoming money, that of which is unearned, a term which is referred to as rent, that will be used solely to benefit the 1%, while the rest of the population is ignored. Military budgets swell, while money for education is suddenly non-existent. The government no longer has to answer to the public. Due to the immense incentive for the government to allow extractive companies to pump out all natural resources from the ground, non-renewable production in Brazil is rapidly accelerating. The abundance of these resources is undeniable. The country as a whole is 13th in the world for oil production, with 2.3 million barrels being produced per day. They are 31st in the world for natural gas production, with about 21 billion cubic meters extracted annually. Coal production totals to about 3.2 million tons per year. It's important to keep in mind that there is a difference between resources and reserves. Reserves describe the amount of a substance that can be extracted with current technology at current prices. Resources, on the other hand, are an estimated value that researchers are confident in saying is present, but may not be economically viable to extract for a variety of reasons. Brazil has been blessed or cursed with many unrenewable reserves. There are 388.7 billion cubic meters proven reserves of natural gas, 15.31 billion barrels proven reserves of crude oil, and 6,630 million tons of coal. Solely on coal, Brazil could power itself for 16 and a half years, with current reserves at current consumptive rates. The BP Statistical Review in 2014 reported that 146.5 million tons of oil were consumed per year by Brazil. Now that might seem like a lot, which it is, but if we compare per capita use with the United States, it can give us a little perspective. In Brazil, 10 barrels are used per day per 1,000 people. In the United States, 61 barrels are used per day per 1,000 people. According to BP, Brazil consumes 3.5 million tons oil equivalent of nuclear power. Also reported by BP, 39.6 billion cubic meters of natural gas are consumed yearly. 15.3 million tons oil equivalent of coal are consumed every year. By far the largest consumption in terms of finite resources is oil. Production of renewable energies are surprisingly prevalent in Brazil. A large part of Brazil's electricity comes from hydroelectric power. About 69% of all electricity comes from hydroelectric dams. Although dams have many positive aspects like irrigation, flood control, water storage, and power, it's also important to consider the negative impacts like increased evaporation and decreased stream temperature, which will negatively impact native fish populations. Dams also block fish migration and restrict sedimentation from occurring, which blocks the flow of nutrients to ecosystems downstream. Ethanol is another renewable resource that has become an integral part of Brazil's economy. In fact, it is the second largest producer of ethanol fuel in the world. In 2010, the EPA assigned Brazilian sugarcane ethanol as an advanced biofuel, which means that there is a 61% reduction in the total life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. Solar, wind, and tidal power are all part of Brazil's energy sector, but they only make up a very small portion. solar deployment accounts for less than 0.01% of all Brazil's energy. Although this is such a small fraction of 1%, it's actually one of the highest indices in the world. Renewable energy that has already been installed compared with the potential that Brazil has yet to explore are two vastly different quantities. Currently, Brazil has 113 wind farms installed, which generates only about 2.7 gigawatts. There is a huge potential for wind, upwards of 143 gigawatts, that could be generated due to blustering coastlines. Tidal power is another example of a relatively untouched energy source. Brazil has one of the first wave energy converters in Latin America, which was recently installed in Ceará in 2012. This plant has the potential to generate 87 gigawatts of power. Several government goals have been set in order to keep pushing towards a more sustainable Brazil. Its warm climate with rich resources gives an advantage no other country has. Brazil is blessed with between 4 to 6 sun hours per day, so their government has made plans to have 1.2 million solar systems in 2024, which would generate 7 gigawatts. Ethanol, a renewable fuel, has been pushed by the government for public use. Currently, the majority of cars are mandated to run on biofuel. As production increases further due to better and more effective irrigation techniques and biological control, this mandate will expand. According to the CIA Factbook, Brazil has 4,000 airports, second in the world in comparison, 28,000 kilometers of railways, 1.5 million kilometers of paved and unpaved roadways. This image depicts an accurate representation of the state of transportation in Brazil. Automobiles are used frequently by the population. As the population expands and the middle class grows, the demand for cars has increased. In fact, the number of cars in Brazil has more than doubled in the last 10 years, according to the Rio Times. According to various sources, bus travel is not ideal because it is time-consuming for tourists. Buses are inefficient and cars are becoming more prevalent. This could potentially lead to an addiction to oil, like most of the developed world. The National Department of Traffic reported that the number of cars in Brazil has increased 123%. The government should be investing in more efficient public transportation instead of inefficient and wasteful car transport. Cars emit many greenhouse gases. Let's take a look at other environmental concerns with energy use. Improper mining techniques contribute to land degradation and groundwater pollution. Of course, consuming all of these fossil fuels leads to air quality concerns. From consumption of energy alone, Brazil emits 500.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide every year. Carbon dioxide is a deadly greenhouse gas. The concern is that even rainforests, due to fragmentation from deforestation, are releasing a sizable amount of CO2 as well as direct outputs from cars and industry, etc. Rainforests and trees in general are known to be carbon sinks, much like our oceans. So when they are cut down, the trees release the carbon they have previously stored, which accelerates the devastating impacts of our changing climate. Shale oil specifically has been a new frontier in Brazil, but there has been a lot of public backlash concerning the environmental risks of this practice. Deforestation, due to the extraction of crude oil and of shale, of the Amazon basin endangers native flora and fauna through direct habitat destruction and indirect habitat segmentation and degradation, illegal wildlife trade, severe oil spills, air and water pollution of the Rio de Janeiro. The social problems caused by oil extraction are largely unreported. In the western Amazon, 50 indigenous groups live within oil and gas hotspots that are under pre-production or exploration. Many of the indigenous groups are the world's last isolated indigenous people. There are a lot of oil reserves in Brazil that unfortunately will most likely be exploited, much to the expense of those who cannot afford or do not have the tools to speak out about it to stop it. This leads us to the politics of energy. It is somewhat unfortunate how big of a role politics plays in energy production and consumption. The CIA reported that nuclear power has become 3% of Brazil's overall energy use. There are always temptations and concerns about nuclear weapon production in countries who rely on nuclear power. Every year, Brazil consumes 3.5 million tons oil equivalent of nuclear power. In order to keep suspicions at bay, Brazil has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In terms of oil and politics, corruption runs rampant. Petrobras, pictured earlier in the presentation, is involved in a hefty corruption scandal. According to prosecutors, a small number of top Petrobras officials overcharged the oil company for construction and service work. Some of the money was kept between the officials, but the most interesting part is that it was also shared with political figures. Reported by the New York Times, 51% of the company is government-owned, so many executives owe their jobs to those elected. Brazilians protested the injustices. The power of the people is undeniable. The people must uphold their government to a higher standard. In doing so, the future of Brazil will be bright. If this country resists the temptation of corruption from extractable unrenewables and switches to pioneering renewables like solar, advanced biofuels, wind, tidal, and hydro to lead a larger part of its energy industry, then its future is promising. If Brazil looks towards achieving its many goals, national security, resource independence, and environmental conservation are all possible outcomes.